Welcome back. A few of you have messaged me about this session, which is one that I know I've been looking forward to. Dr. Prash is a specialist in many different fields, but what he is talking about today is specifically the role that psychedelics can have, which is interesting because Daniel Pinchbeck was talking about this earlier, the role that psychedelics could have in allowing some new avenues and pathways to be paved in our thought processes as humanity. Just going to bring him into the room now.
Hello.
Hello, Dr. Prash. How are you doing?
Good day. I'm well.
Good. Are we allowed to see your
Oh, sorry. Apologies. There we go. I'm in. Hi.
So finally meet you.
Yeah. Likewise.
Welcome to the Global Unity Center.
Thank you. Are we live at the moment?
We are live.
Oh, right.
Hey everybody. We're just on a consistent stream all day, so it's never not live, but we can do a check-in. The community and the audience have been super invested throughout all of the talks. So are you in Sydney at the moment?
I am in Sydney at the moment, yeah. Sort of been flitting back and forth between Bondi and Byron, which is almost a bit of a cliched stereotype, isn't it?
It is a little bit.
Yeah, it is.
But then you're giving a talk on the future of psychedelics, so I feel like that really...
I am ticking off all the cliches. Yeah, true.
So we've had some really amazing conversations, Prash, over the past couple of days around obviously unity. And even though we've had this conversation through many different lenses now, from finance, economics, race, somatically, what that means. We just had Naveen Jain come and speak, the former CEO of InfoSpace. So many different angles. And one thing that has been just this amazing through line through the whole summit and all of the conversations is that unity really is about being able to exist in amongst many different truths simultaneously. It's not about forcing everyone to be on the same page. Now, I'm not going to admit to having experienced any sort of psychedelics publicly before, but what I will say.
It's all right, I will.
Perfect. You can do that. You can do that for us. What I will say is one of the things that fascinates me the most about this, the research into psychedelics, is how it can activate multiple parts of our brain simultaneously, and thus potentially bring us closer to more understanding of unity, oneness, unity consciousness. And I really just want to kick it off. I know you've got a talk for us today, so I want to at some point turn myself off so the community can just see you. But I would love you to just speak on that, and then we can maybe get into the presentation that you have.
Sure. I mean, as far as being put on the spot goes, this is a relatively easy one when you're talking about psychedelics. There's a key point, a distinct moment in every psychedelic experience, where at the same time or simultaneously, you are one, aware of the fact that each of us, or we're talking about from the self perspective, that you as a self, as an entity, is an inescapable and integral thread in this greater tapestry that makes up, the universe, society, humanity, reality. And that without you, without that thread being present, that entire tapestry would be missing. And while at the same time being intimately aware of your own sort of insignificance in comparison to that which is around you. Particularly, for example, when you're faced with being in the middle of nature in the psychedelic experience, and the enormity and grandeur of the trees around you, which have existed for in various forms for all eternity, and being aware of your ego dissolving and being aware of your own insignificance at that moment. And that moment when you are aware simultaneously of your own absolute insignificance and of your absolute significance, and therefore just how necessary and just how part of that sort of intelligible matrix that you are. That for me is one of those crucial learning points that people often get to in the psychedelic experience, which once you have seen, you cannot unsee. And yeah, so it's hard to talk about psychedelics and not mention unity in some way.
Profound. And so much of your research has been geared towards making it more kosher and accessible for people to be able to have these experiences in the context of psychotherapy. And yeah, first of all, just thank you for being courageous and being at the front line of a conversation that is controversial. These are the conversations that we're inviting into this summit, that there are leaders out there on the leading edge that really are pioneering more unity in the world in varying capacities, and you're definitely one of them, Prash. So we appreciate your presence so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm going to let you, I'm going to hand it over to you so you can do your talk, and then maybe at the end we can have a bit of a Q&A.
Please. Yeah, I'll try not to take too much time, and then we can chat after.
Let's do it.
Shall I share my screen?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm right here, but I'm going to turn my video off so it's not distracting.
Sure. All right. Is that coming across fine? I'm just going to presume it is if no one says otherwise.
It's perfect.
Perfect. All right. Well, hello, everyone. You've already met me. My name's Prash. I wear a number of different hats, but but principally the hat that I'm here. And the rest of the hats are probably on my LinkedIn, but the principal hat that I'm here to talk about is psychedelics, and in particular psychedelics and their role in psychiatry, in psychotherapy, the therapeutic use of psychedelics. This has been my background is that I'm a medical doctor. I trained in psychiatry, and psychedelics have been my particular research interest and my soapbox for at least the last 6-7 years. And it's a controversial field. Those of us who work in the industry would like to tell you it shouldn't be anywhere near as controversial as it is, but history will obviously tell you otherwise. And it's why venturing into the field is, it's this constant decision of whether this is a brave new world, or is this marriage of heaven and hell, which for the geeky among us are both titles of books by Aldous Huxley, who himself is one of the sort of foremost psychedelic philosophers or authors. The reasons why this is a necessary conversation to have now. For one, and amidst all of the chaos happening in North America at the moment, and there's no other way to really describe it, there have been a few silver linings on that dark cloud, and this is one of them. So psilocybin has been legalized for medical use in Oregon, first state to do that in this election. There's been a whole host of other drug law reform movements that have come through as well, including Oregon decriminalizing everything, legalization being slightly different from decriminalization of possession. But this is pretty significant, and if anything, is a sort of benchmark of where psychedelic therapy has come in the last 5 to 10 years. Other reasons to talk about it is that the scientific community is waking up, although I'll say waking up again, because psychedelic research was rife in the 70s, which we will touch on in a little bit, but it has certainly escalated in the last decade or so. And it's sort of everywhere. Michael Pollan, for those of you who've heard of him, released a book called How to Change Your Mind, which I hope it didn't, I wish it didn't take someone didn't take Michael Pollan to come out and write a book for people to start waking up to the idea, but he does write beautifully, and he's got mainstream reach that I guess the researchers at Johns Hopkins don't necessarily have. But the psychedelic movement is popping up all over the place. Psychedelic therapy is taking off, at least in researcher centers around the world. Johns Hopkins has launched a whole center for psychedelic research. Here in Australia, in Melbourne, St. Vincent's launched the first trial into using psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, to treat anxiety in terminally ill patients. And over on Wall Street, well, more technically on the in the Nasdaq, Compass Pathways was the first company in the psychedelic drug market to hit a $1 billion market capital on its IPO. So the stuff's hitting the mainstream. It most certainly is hitting the mainstream. And that in itself, I guess, is the reason to taking interest. But the other thing to point out is that this stuff isn't new. It's not the last 10 years that psychedelics really happened. The reality is that psychedelics have been used throughout history. If you look back through the Vedantas, if you look back through scripture, if you look back into religious sacrament, psychedelics have almost been part of them. I'd go so far as to say for almost as long as there has been a religious sacrament. The Eleusinian mysteries, this whole area, this place in Greece called Eleusis, in itself is steeped in psychedelic history. Throughout different civilizations, there's evidence of humans having engaged with psychedelic substances. And this is, from an evolutionary perspective, we have to look at the fact that these things are still here and they're all around us. In Australian soil, we have the psilocybin suberginosa, or the psilocybe cubensis mushrooms. We have the psychedelic toad that produces 5-MeO-DMT. The acacia bark, the bark of the acacia tree in Australia has some of the highest concentrations of DMT in the world, which is the same sort of active ingredient that tourists travel all the way to South America to take ayahuasca for. Throughout Central and South America, you have multiple different types of psychedelic cactus. This is nature's sort of pumping this out at us, and humans have engaged with it throughout history, and that's why these substances are still here, with the wisdom still sort of flowing through. To an extent, we've just forgotten how to engage with them. We engage with alcohol far more easily than we engage with these substances. But even if that's in ancient history, the modern history of psychedelics starts with, Merck, which is a pharmaceutical company, developed MDMA, started using in psychotherapy, principally in couples therapy, which is pretty interesting, in the early 1900s. The modern history of psychedelics, though, really starts with Albert Hofmann and Sandoz Laboratories. In 1938, Sandoz Laboratories synthesized a derivative of the ergot, the ergotamine fungus. Initially, they were trying to market it as a respiratory stimulant. They didn't find much use as a respiratory stimulant, and it was sort of shelved. And in 1943, actually on the 16th of April, 1943, in Basel, a scientist by the name of Albert Hofmann started experimenting with it. And the story goes that he accidentally got some on his fingers or on his skin, then got home, and the world just wasn't quite exactly the same. And so 3 days later, on the 19th of April, 1943, he ingested 200 micrograms of this substance, which was lysergic acid 25 diethylamide, or LSD, and got on his bicycle and cycled home, or tried to cycle home. That was the world's first ever intentional acid trip. It's still celebrated around the world as Bicycle Day. More people take acid on the 19th of April than any other day in the year. And it really sparked off the modern wave of psychedelics and interest in psychedelics. Between the 1950s up to about 1970, there were about 120 different trials just sponsored by the US government. About 40,000 patients took part in these therapeutic trials. Sandoz Laboratories was sending out these vials, like the label that you see on the right, of dialacid, to any scientists who wanted to research it, because they were desperate to find a sort of a pharmaceutical application for it. But in 1970, Richard Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act, which sparked off, well, it was the first big landmark in the war on drugs, and relegated psychedelics to being a Schedule A substance. Now, in the same category as heroin and cocaine. In fact, not even in the same category as cocaine, because cocaine eye drops had a medical purpose, which is astounding. We know now, and it's been openly admitted, that it had nothing to do with science and nothing to do with evidence. In a way, the psychedelic movement dug its own grave. The counterculture, it was too intrinsically entwined with the counterculture movement and the counterculture revolution. And the counterculture at that moment, at that point in time, was hugely anti-war. And at that point in history, the 1970s, there was nothing more dangerous for the administration than being anti the Vietnam War. And so in a very severe case of collateral damage, psychedelic use was criminalized in 1970, MDMA use criminalized in the 80s. And research sort of stopped, which is pretty criminal. But as we've sort of outlined, we're seeing a resurgence in research. And I'd like to spend much of this talk not necessarily presenting the research, because that stuff is readily available and a lot of you have probably read it in some shape or form. I thought I'd rather explain perhaps the why, and a bit more about these substances, how they perhaps work, in the hope that when you do see these articles pop up, you have some context, or you're able to put it into some sort of context. If this comes up at a dinner table conversation, and you hear a stigmatized viewpoint, you can respond adequately in an informed manner. So what are psychedelics? This is how I like to classify drugs. I mean, there's simple ways to classify drugs, fun and not fun, but the most conventional way tends to be uppers and downers, stimulants and depressants, but it's actually, there's a lot more nuance to it than that. There are stimulants, there are depressants, and I like to add two more axes to it, which is the empathogenic axis. That's so called because it invokes feelings of empathy and oneness with your common man. And MDMA is probably the most typical empathogen. And then you have the psychedelic axis. And no drug sits cleanly on any one axis. Every drug sort of follows this three-dimensional axis of having, if I was to extend this, and you can consider something like cannabis. Cannabis is principally a depressant, so-called, not a stimulant, a depressant, but it definitely has some empathogenic properties, and depending on the THC to CBD content, has some psychedelic properties. And this is true with most drugs that we engage in, whereas pure psychedelics tend to be, well, predominantly psychedelic, but often with a considerable empathogenic component. But going into it in a bit more detail, the main protagonists, acid or LSD, it's covered with the Beatles, who to this day insist that Lucy in the Sky with diamonds had nothing to do with acid. I'll leave you to decide. The bottom you have, those are not your typical magic mushrooms. Your typical magic mushrooms, the psilocybin containing magic mushrooms, are actually considerably more boring to look at. These are the Amanita muscaria mushrooms, or the fly agaric. They are psychedelic in themselves. They don't actually contain psilocybin. Instead, they contain some different substances, muscimol and ibotenic acid, which are in themselves extremely psychedelic, but they cannot be eaten raw. In fact, they're poisonous. They can induce a cholinergic delirium when eaten raw and need to be prepared carefully. But these are found abundantly in Australia, base of every pine forest in autumn. Up top is the peyote cactus, which contains mescaline. And then there's ayahuasca, which is very prevalent in South America. Its active ingredient is DMT, as we've talked about. These are some of examples of some of the main protagonists we talk about. In psychedelic therapy, though, you'll often hear mention of MDMA. In fact, some of the earliest trials and some of the largest trials to date are into MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, is MDMA a psychedelic? Hard one. It isn't a typical psychedelic. It's often classed as a psychedelic-esque substance. It's, like I said, it's principally an empathogen. But in terms of the functional effects that it may have, and we'll describe some of the phenomenology of the psychedelic experience in a bit, there are distinct similarities to an extent that they can be grouped into psychedelics, at least for the purpose of discussing psychedelic psychotherapy. This bit's less interesting. the science behind it. They're principally serotonergic in that they activate your serotonin system. Some psychedelics have a slight dopaminergic component, but principally they hit your serotonin system. Why that's interesting is that so do, for example, antidepressants, and yet the functional outcome could not be more different. I guess all that tells us is that we know very, very little about how psychedelics actually exert their effect. We know they exert an effect on the serotonin receptor, but we don't actually know how upstream or how downstream that receptor pathway that actually is. My guess is that it's probably quite a bit downstream that the serotonin impact happens. Because if it was quite upstream, you would expect that same trickle down effect with something like antidepressants or any other serotonergic drug. Another thing to understand is that receptor tolerance rises very quickly, in that if you take a psychedelic today, if you take a psychedelic again tomorrow at the same dose, you're unlikely to feel that much. That's a very rapid rise in tolerance, but it also drops off very quickly. And this is often why I've often said that if you find me one person who's physiologically addicted to psychedelics, I'll stop giving these talks, and I stand by that. The addiction potential is almost negligible. In terms of if you've ever experienced the psychedelic or been in the psychedelic state and how exhausting emotionally and cognitively that can be, it makes sense why no one's often in a rush to sort of dart back in there again. But even from a purely scientific and neurobiological basis, there's an explanation as to why. And the other thing to consider is the therapeutic ratio. Therapeutic ratio is a sort of metric to account for the safety profile of any drug. You can see this diagram below that compares the therapeutic ratios and where LSD and psilocybin sit as compared to alcohol, even nicotine, in terms of what dose is required to be lethal. So, the phenomenology of a psychedelic experience. This is attempting to do the impossible, because psychedelics, by nature of the effect that they have, and by the very nature of the fact that the effect they have is so removed from reality as we know it, that using language, this very blunt tool we call language, to try and explain it is near impossible. But we try. Hallucinations, hence the term hallucinogenics, is common. I'd often like to think of it not so much as a true hallucination. A true hallucination, if you want to be really strict about the terminology, is when you're seeing something that isn't there or hearing something that isn't there. A perceptual stimuli is experienced when there wasn't actually a perceptual stimuli there. I think what's more accurate is to think of it as it's like you're seeing new things, that you see old things, but in a completely new way, which we might expand on later. Synesthesia, which is the experience of perceiving one perceptual stimulus in a completely different perceptual modality. So to be able to see a sound, or to be able to hear a taste, which all sounds quite weird until it's actually been experienced. A few other things is a hyper acuity of sensory perception. Think of life in HD. Yeah, sort of seeing it through an HD TV lens. I didn't buy a TV. I haven't had a TV for about 12 years. And then I was renting out putting this apartment up on Airbnb, and I walked into a Harvey Norman to buy a TV. And if you haven't really looked at TVs for 12 years and you walk into a Harvey Norman and you now see the latest, 745-inch plasma LCD TV thing. Sounding like such a noob here, but it's one, a sensory overload, and two, feels like you're tripping. The other two components, which are far more vague, is this idea of ego dissolution, which I sort of started by describing. A stripping away of our ego structures, ego being this strong defense mechanism that we all hold in front of us as a protective shield for our soft, mushy insides that is our psyche. And a stripping away of that ego, stripping away of the defensive shield, so we are more permeable to stimuli, to others, to thought processes that we would otherwise have shut away out of fear. And the resultant effect of all of that is often a sense of, a transcendental experience that is often an existential awakening. And why I started by saying that this is so hard to explain is that we talk about it often as a noetic understanding, one of those where it needs to be perceived to be truly understood. But I just gave it a shot anyway. Now, trying to understand why and how they work. The first thing I'd like to debunk is the biochemical explanation. The idea that the psychedelic substance themselves, psilocybin itself or LSD itself, it goes into the brain, crosses the blood-brain barrier, goes into the brain, and exerts some sort of chemical effect directly on the brain, which produces this long-standing therapeutic change. If that were true, then festivals like Burning Man would be the single largest intervention in terms of global mental health outcomes. And we know that they are not. It's not about the substance, it's about how the substance is used. Set and setting is a term that is often used in psychedelic terminology. Set being your mindset, your headspace going into it, and the setting being exactly what's around you. Are you comfortable? Do you feel safe? Are you hot? Are you cold? Are you fed? Are you hungry? Principally, are you safe? And the third being intention. A psychedelic trip without an intention is a cruise to nowhere. Intention sets a rudder to your course, and then there can be a destination. And in a psychedelic therapy journey, setting that intention from the beginning, yes, there may be meanderings, and sometimes those meanderings take you to more important, vital, perhaps unrecognized destinations. But that initial course is still set by that original intention and is essential. And two other components of every psychotherapeutic journey is preparation and integration. Preparation to get one assessed for any risk factors, but also prepared for what is to come. And then integration, multiple sessions of integration, once a week psychotherapy after, to integrate the learnings from that psychedelic trip into your life going forward. I like to think that any experience in the present, psychedelic or otherwise, any less experience in the present is left behind in the past unless we make an active effort to integrate it into our futures. And that is never true more so than we think of a psychedelic experience. The information overload can be so great that it's easy for it to all be left behind if we don't make active efforts to take it with us into our future. Right. I hope I haven't lost you.
We're right here with you.
Okay.
This is amazing, Prash. So informative.
I'm glad. Thank you for the validation. Right, we'll keep going. Now another way of looking at it, another explanation, and this is which is backed up by neuroimaging data. So there is a region in the brain called the default mode network. The default mode network is a collection of different brain regions. The anterior cingulate cortex, the prefrontal cortex. There are a few brain regions, I won't bore you with the names, which demonstrate a very high degree of neural connectivity in particular times. And in particular, this shows high levels of connectivity in the resting state. And when you say the resting state, it is when you're not involved in task or goal orientated activity. So where there's no executive function sort of overriding it. So think of when you're daydreaming. Think of when you're sitting in the bus, looking out the window and engaged in rumination. Think of when your personality shines forth, where that comes from. It's often the closest thing we have to a neuroscientific correlate to personality, because this is our resting state brain activity. So the default mode network, we know it shows this high regions of connectivity. So these are these brain regions with very high traffic. Now we acknowledge that we've seen that in the psychedelic state, under the effect of psilocybin, for example, we show drastically reduced blood flow to the default mode network. Now, initially, this may seem sort of counterintuitive, right? He's saying that this is what our personality is based on, and this is where our rumination is, and why is there reduced blood flow there? Am I thinking less? No, it means the default, being the key word, the default network, the default connections are showing reduced connectivity, which means there's new connectivity elsewhere. Which means the set, constrained, typical ways of thinking that have formed this default mode network have been disrupted, and new manners of finding, end pathways are being found. Another example is this image on the right, which looked at the entropy in brain states under psilocybin and just using a placebo, and you can see what's happening in the psilocybin section. It's like a 5-year-old taking a crayon to paper. In a lot of ways, that's what psychedelics do. They return us to a childlike state where there is infinite curiosity and very little set pathways. I often think of psychedelics as being like after years of battling through traffic and taking the same route to work, it's the days you download Waze, or the day you download Waze, if anyone's familiar with the app. And all of a sudden, all these side routes pop up through the suburbs, and you go down streets you've never been down before, you discover routes you've never been down before. That's perhaps a very sort of blunt analogy for how they work. Oops. Okay. Don't get bogged down in the detail, just concentrate on the pretty pictures. This is more looking at MDMA, and I bring this up to be because it's slightly different. And let's talk particularly about PTSD. Now, we know that most of the trials in MDMA-assisted psychotherapy have been in PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. One of the main difficulties in trying to treat PTSD is that any manner of treatment, any manner of psychotherapeutic treatment of PTSD involves the patient trying to recount the memory, recount that traumatic incident, or at least it draws that patient back in that direction in some way. When memories are stored, I mean, we can almost think about it bluntly as there being two modalities in which memories are imprinted in our brains. Right? You have the actual autobiographical, factual nature of the memory, and then you have the emotional nature of the memory. Like, think of, if I said the word vomiting to you, the reflex response for most of us is an unpleasant thought. It's often the unpleasant memory of vomiting that comes up first before any actual memory of like, what did it feel like for my esophagus to be squeezing up my throat as the food came out? Like, that bit's often secondary. It's the emotional memory that floods us first. Now think of that, but expand it out to a dramatically traumatic memory that has been that traumatic that has caused you severe, long-lasting and dysfunctional psychological distress. Imagine the emotional flooding that precedes any attempt at getting to the autobiographical nature of the memory. Now keep that in mind and consider this, that the emotional component of memory is often embedded within areas of the brain, like the amygdala, the hippocampus. And we know that in the MDMA state, there is a reduction in blood flow, which is actually what these complicated diagrams are trying to show, a reduction in blood flow to the hippocampal states, well, to the hippocampus. Consider what this means functionally, that if you're able to recall the autobiographical memory without the emotional flooding, because your hippocampus is being dialed down, imagine how useful that would be in being able to work through that memory without the emotional fatigue that usually makes therapy have to terminate prematurely. So just a hint at some of the therapeutic promise. All right, another hypothesis, and I'm just sort of hitting you with hypotheses from multiple angles here. This is the transcendental hypothesis, or I often call it the doors of perception hypothesis. If anyone has read this book by Aldous Huxley, The Doors of Perception, amazing piece of psychedelic literature from the 60s. Now the title of the book, The Doors of Perception. In fact, the book, that the band The Doors got their title from the book, The Doors of Perception. And Aldous Huxley got the title The Doors of Perception from a line in a poem by William Blake from the 1790s. called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And Blake writes, remember this correctly, for when the doors of perception are cleansed, man will see the world for what it truly is, infinite, for he sees the world through the narrow chinks of his cavern. The doors of perception, as Blake understood it, and as Aldous Huxley later expanded upon it, are these integral perceptual filters that we all have within us. There is reality, or whatever we want to consider it, call it, but none of us ever really have any true idea of what it actually is, because we see the world through these perceptual lenses. All we have is our subjective experience of reality. We have our subjective realities. We attempt to try and agree on an approximation of what reality may be by putting together all of our subjective realities and muddling it together to some idea of, sort of communal, common consensus. But it's our doors of perception, our perceptual lenses, that modulate and frame how we perceive that reality. The psychedelic experience, or psychedelics, as Huxley puts it to us, crack open those doors of perception so that we no longer see them through the infinite chinks of our cavern, but rather are exposed to perhaps a greater breadth of perceptual stimuli that is out there. That perhaps, in sort of saying the narrow realities as we saw them, we now conceive, as I brought up earlier, all things in a completely new way. And perhaps that is one of the things that is necessary, considering the world we live in today. The last bit, I think, in terms of explanations, is a more psychological perspective. This image is from the Freudian school of psychoanalysis, which often talks about the id, the ego, and the superego. Principally, I'd like to concentrate on the idea of the ego. The ego is something we all have, and which is vital to all of us. I've talked about it earlier as being this defensive shield, and we sort of need it because we're all soft and mushy on the inside. We're all fragile internal beings, and we develop this hard shell around us called our ego to protect us. But a result of that hard shell of the ego is that we end up with, and this is again drawing from psychoanalytic thought and terminology, a discrepancy between the true self and that false self. The most obvious and with the greatest discrepancy, the most obvious false shell we can think of now is probably an Instagram profile, right? If you have an Instagram account, therein lies probably the upper limits of your false self. And you will continue to propagate that and harden that shelf as much as you can. The true self lies very far from that external identity. And even taking that extreme end of the picture out of the question, even on a day-to-day basis, a false self is something we all have. The identity, the truth that we present to the other is quite different to the truth that we acknowledge within ourselves. And some would suggest in being able to narrow that discrepancy between the true self and the false self is where contentment lies. However, it is impossible to even start that process if you are not aware of the distinction of the upper and lower limits of those boundaries. Like if you are not aware of where your true self ends and where your false self begins, or where the extent of your false self is, or where your true self got forgotten many decades ago, it is virtually impossible to actually try and address it. And that is where the psychedelic experience, which peels back those ego layers, that ego disillusion that is so common across the psychedelic experience, can be so useful in enhancing your self-knowledge. If self-knowledge is the first step on the path to liberation, then psychedelics have been a very useful place to start in therapy. The other element, to be brief, is control. I've heard multiple people tell me that they're terrified of the psychedelic experience because they don't want to lose control. No one wants to lose control. Let's just be clear. You're not alone on this. You're not unique. No one likes losing control. Sort of, it's inbuilt into all of our psyches that we want to maintain control. But to be in a situation where you are able to give up control, were you able to hand over control to a power greater than you, is an incredibly learning lesson to take into life with us. So I'm rushing through now because I recognize that I'm getting ahead in time, and this is the end of it. And this is perhaps the more, there's almost political element in all of this. That it's a quote by Terence McKenna, which I adore, that psychedelics are illegal, not because there's anything to do with science or evidence, but because it challenges authority structures. I've always said that psychedelics will always be the most dangerous drug in the world. Not because they're dangerous from a physiological standpoint by any way, but because danger is defined by the box in which it is in, and therefore it is going to be defined by those which sit at the top of the pyramid, because it is what is dangerous to the structure. And if you look at it that way, psychedelics, which make you think, which are, if anything, disruptive technologies which cause you to innovate and challenge the long accepted models of thinking, are phenomenally dangerous to any sort of structure. And while, yes, that may seem to be leading to an anarchic paradigm if completely let loose upon the world, I'd like you to consider that even on a scaled down version, at least internally within yourself, what that would do if you gave something the capacity to challenge your internal structures of what is right, what is wrong, what is true, what is false, and what is ethical and what is not. And that is where a lot of the promise for me lies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prash. Wow, what a wealth of research. And are you hopeful now with all of this taking into consideration and such compelling research? Are you really confident that this is going to become more and more mainstream and have the stigma, just diminish in the near future? And there's some questions here from people with specific questions around how psychedelics can be treated in specific challenges. So we'll get to that. But yeah.
The answer to that first question is the momentum is gathering and at an exponential rate. And it's not the underground movement. It's not in little back rooms. We're talking about Johns Hopkins, we're talking about NYU, we're talking about UCL, Imperial College, St. Vincent's here. Australia has been sort of behind the curve, as we often are. But even here, it is catching up. And it is hard to unsee once you have seen. And it's hard to deny the evidence. And I am very, very hopeful. I do see this as sort of where medical cannabis was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, except the evidence is far more objective, and I'd say far stronger than it ever has been for medical cannabis. One of the issues with research is that psychedelic trials are difficult to get off the ground. They're expensive. You're dealing with illegal substances. The amount of regulatory loopholes you have to jump through, sorry, not loopholes, hoops you have to jump through, make these things incredibly arduous to get off the ground. But as more and more of it happens, there will be a groundswell, and that is what we're looking forward to.
Yeah, amazing. And I feel like in a way you touched on this, but someone's asked, can you speak to the traumatic experiences caused from doing psychedelics without intention? And how do we
absolutely
how do we move forward in that conversation, and I guess break the idea that it's just only a recreational thing, or that
yeah, happy to. So psychedelics can be used recreationally. They often are used recreationally, but I would almost draw the difference between recreational psychedelic use and the way it is used therapeutically is, in a way, the difference between heroin and backstreet heroin and morphine in the hospital. They're essentially the same compound, essentially the same substance, but it's the setting and the intention, as well as the supervision, that make all of the difference. Now, bad trips, or challenging trips, as I prefer to call them, they're terrifying. I'll be the first person to come out there and tell you that they're absolutely terrifying, because they take you into the deepest, darkest recesses of your mind. And the deepest, darkest recesses of your mind is a terrifying place. It's why we don't venture there. Having said that, if it is done in a safe setting, if it is done in the therapeutic environment, it is almost welcomed. I don't like the word bad trip because it's a value loaded term attached to it, but a challenging trip is really where all the learning happens. That is what you actually go looking for. Consider this, consider that a mushroom has no thought content, nothing. The content is all within you. And if it is all within you, all the stuff that's coming out is stuff that's hidden within you all the time that blindsides you on an idle Tuesday. That's where your anxieties come from, which you don't visit until they subconsciously come and hit you. And then you end up in a panic attack, or you end up in an argument with your partner because of a narrative you've placed on what they said, because this is what your pre-existing view of the world is. Imagine an environment where you know there's rising damp down below, and you choose to just batter down the hatches, whereas you can go down into these dungeons. You can confront the demons. You can actually walk up to a demon and say hello, knowing that they cannot harm you because you are in this psychedelic realm. And in 6 hours, when you're out of there, no physiological harm can actually come to you, but you would have confronted, you would have identified, and then in the sessions of integration after, you can actually work through that demon that you now know exists, but previously was always there, but you were just hiding from.
Have you ever seen instances where someone who's had, a recreationally traumatic experience with psychedelics then rectify that same trauma in a controlled psychedelic experience?
Yeah, in fact, there are lots of practitioners, particularly in areas, certainly in Australia, where psychedelic therapy isn't legal yet, apart from in research settings, who offer integration sessions. The Australian Psychedelic Society offer a integration circle support group. Mind Medicine Australia, which is one of the biggest advocacy groups of psychedelic research in Australia, offer a service where you can see a psychologist for integration. Yes, you don't need to have gone through psychedelic therapy to then seek out integration. If you've had a psychedelic experience, and whether that has gone well or not, then seeking out integration is always a responsible way to either learn from an experience or to try and recover from what could have been a really challenging experience.
Yeah, thank you. There's another question here regarding your insights into how and if you've seen psychedelics be able to support someone with epilepsy.
The short answer is no. No, not psychedelics. Certainly medical cannabis has a lot of evidence in intractable epilepsy. I don't know of any research of psychedelics in epilepsy, and to some extent you would be cautious there in terms of the potential to lower seizure threshold. Again, it's not clearly studied, it's not well studied, and you'd probably want to study that in animal models first to look at what it does in seizure threshold before you then proceed on to trying on human models. There has been research into the use of psychedelics in outside of treating mental health disorders. So it's been investigated in Alzheimer's. It's been investigated for tension headaches and migraines. So the scope is expanding. But I think until we've got sort of proper animal trials through, the use in epilepsy would be hazardous.
Yeah, thank you for that, Prash. Just want to make sure that, so there's actually a few people that are asking around PTSD and bipolar disorder specifically, and I know you spoke to that a little bit, but maybe I spoke about PTSD, I think, in quite a bit of detail. So I'm sorry, there's something I should have sort of stated from the outset, in that as much as we talk about the safety profile of psychedelics, and particularly in mental health, there was a 150,000 person respondent survey in 2016 called Krebs et al., which then identified that there was no statistically significant increase in adverse mental health outcomes. There's probably one caveat in that is that we don't recommend the use of psychedelics in anyone with a predisposition to a psychotic illness. Now, it's a similar line to how we talk about cannabis
We know cannabis doesn't cause schizophrenia, but if you have a predisposition to developing a psychotic illness, a family history of schizophrenia, a past history of drug-induced psychosis, for example, cannabis can be a trigger. And it is similar with psychedelics. Yes, there haven't been advanced trials into this, but the suggestions that we have are that it is distinctly preferable to avoid it, and it is definitely a sort of a hard contraindication in any clinical trials for anyone with a psychotic disorder. And bipolar disorder, at least the manic episodes in bipolar disorder, tend to fall into that psychotic end of the spectrum. And so for the most part, its use in bipolar disorder would not be recommended. And if anything, at this stage, until we have further research, which is going to be a tricky business because of the risk, until that point, we would probably not be seeing it used in bipolar disorder.
So really, PTSD and depression are sort of the two main disorders we've seen.
Addiction disorders. In addiction disorders, in anxiety, particularly end-of-life anxiety. These are probably the most studied indications at the moment.
Incredible. And what's next with your own work and research?
Well, the paper I'm currently working on at the moment is looking into altered states of consciousness in addiction, and contrasting hypnosis, transcendental meditation, and psychedelic therapy as three modalities that try and harness the altered conscious state, and looking at the results in addiction studies. So,
do you fundamentally believe, Prash, that these experiences that someone can have going through those doors of perception, their experience in the deep realms of psychedelic experiences, can be reached in similar timeframes with any other modality?
I think you hit the nail on the head there in terms of talking about timeframes. I think that's the kicker here, in that I do think that deep meditation, deep sustained meditation, in someone who is a trained meditator who's been doing this for decades, they can get to similar states. But and this is one of the criticisms that's often leveled against psychedelics, in that it's just a cheat sheet, and you're rushing it, right? It's a means of it's a wormhole into the experience, as opposed to doing all the work over years to get there. And yes, it is definitely in terms of time profile, it is the fastest way to access that level of knowing. And yeah, you can look at it as a cheat sheet, but so some people don't have time. Some people are dying. Some people are on the verge of suicide. Some people are immaculately depressed and they don't have time. And if this works, and if it can be carried out safely and effectively, and just because it's quick, it doesn't mean it's hard work. Like the challenging trips that people sometimes go through when they're coming out of the depths of a depression, they do come out of it, but that stuff is hard work, and the integration after is hard work. So yeah, sort of a long-winded way of answering that question, but I don't think that for the same time effect that there is another way of getting to that depth of alteration of conscious state.
Has there been any sort of measurement around like the physiological impacts in terms of like how we're actually vibrating our frequency as an individual when we have had many sort of drug-induced experiences?
I think the short answer to that is no. There have been commonalities found with frequent in terms of fMRI states with frequent psychedelics users and frequent meditators, which I found quite interesting. I think there was an Imperial College study that put people in an MRI machine. But beyond that, I mean, if we're using the word frequent drug users, I guess we need to differentiate between there are drugs and then there are drugs, and psychedelics would be in a very different realm to something like heroin or coffee or alcohol. It's why I struggle with the word drug. It's a very broad term with not enough specificity to the terminology.
Yeah. Specifically psychedelic substances.
Yeah, but no, not that I'm aware of in terms of energetic frequencies, and the scientific population don't always tend to cross the same paths that easily. I think there's a greater awakening towards the more esoteric elements of consciousness. And to an extent, the move towards bringing meditation into the mental health sphere, the move towards bringing psychedelics into the mental health sphere, even a move towards a consideration of the importance of sleep, nutrition, hygiene, sexual health into the mental health sphere. Even that's unfortunately a relatively recent phenomenon. And the more that happens, I think we're seeing a shift in the right direction. It's just the patience that we are just contend with at the moment.
Prash, again, thank you so much for your insights, your generosity of time. So appreciative.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. Good luck with the rest of it, and I'll tune in later.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Prash.
Righty. Cheers, everyone.